Hello, good morning, everybody. Hello,
Good
hello.
morning, sir.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, sir.
As you all know, today we will have discussion on MEG-10 Block 5. Block 5, dear participants, for your information, Block 5 uh, gives its focus on problems of teaching and learning English literature. One of the most actually burning topic which we are going to discuss today, MEG-10, Block 5, and in Block 5, the discussion centers on problems of teaching and learning English literature. Uh, uh, so, uh, in this unit, we shall examine the role and function of teaching English literature. In this unit, in block 5, we shall examine the role and function of teaching English literature in India uh, in our contemporary social context. In our contemporary social context, we will examine the role and function of teaching English literature in India. Mm, uh, Participants, we shall also briefly look at some of the comments, some of the views, some of the opinions of uh, experts, some of the comments made by some academics and critics on this issue. As you know, uh, what is the topic on which we are going to have a discussion today, participants? What is the topic on which we are going to have our discussion today? Please tell me.
The role and function of teaching and English literature.
Problems of uh, teaching, uh, if problems of teaching and learning English literature in Indian context. In Indian context, ah, in our contemporary social context. Okay. So, to begin with, we can start. To begin with, we need to think uh, in depth about English studies in India. We it is necessary on our part to go deep into the actually into the depth of English studies in India. If we attempt it, a, mm, a rigorous historicizing of teaching English literature in India would be inevitable on our part. Uh, and teaching English literature in India, after all, is a product of an important period, is a product of an important period. Uh, it is a product of an important period in our nation's history. Hmm. Teaching English, teaching English literature in India is a product of an important period in our nation's history. In an uh, in in our previous discussion in earlier blocks, we analyzed the place of English in post-independence India and the space occupied by English in Indian multilingual setting. In our previous classes, we have already have a threadbare discussion on those points. Uh, while the fashioning of middle class subjectively has been historically ordained or regulated by the institutionalizing of English studies in colonial India, which demands for English, it has steadily continued in the past 5 decades and has remained unabated. Uh, it is a fact which all of us uh, have to admit. The position of English as a tool of command, the position of English as a tool of communication, the position of English as a tool of communication, uh, as a language, as a signpost of cultural privilege has tremendously increased. The position of English as a tool of communication, the position of English as a medium of instruction, medium of teaching has tremendously increased in the past 2 decades. In as much as globalization has made English learning a necessary stepping stone to social success and material gain. It is a fact. I repeat it again, friends. So, the position of English as a tool of communication, the position of English as a medium of instruction in schools and colleges, the position of English uh, as a tool of command has tremendously increased in the past few decades. In as much as globalization has made English learning a necessary stepping stone to social success and material gain. Uh, the blessing, the boom in information technology has benefited English knowing Indians immensely uh, in the both in the job market, in the professional dimensions, in academics, in academic field. The liberalization in the information and broadcasting sector, the expansion of print and electronic media, the steady growth of numerous news channels, the increased glamour and social success of copywriters, advertisement personnel, uh, such have been the areas where English is extensively used and valued. Uh, Liberalization uh, actually has provided sufficient opportunity. Liberalization in the information and broadcasting sector, expansion of print and electronic media, steady growth of numerous news channels, increased glamour and social success of copywriters and advertisement personnels. These are the areas, and such have been the prominent areas, important areas where English is extensively used and valued. So, uh, uh, it is very important. It is therefore I told you that it is the topic on which we are going to have our discussion today. Bears importance, bears significance, bears meaning, has a bearing on the English learners. Uh, One has to critically examine the nature of jobs offered to us in global market in response to our command over this language. So depending upon our command, depending on our competence, depending on our proficiency, depending on our command on this language, uh, actually uh, the nature of job we are offered, it depends on it depends on the global market in response to our command, in response to our competence, in response to our proficiency, in response to our ability to master over the language, to have competence on the language. So, we should also notice that neocolonial paradigms govern the global job market naturally. So, information technology has expanded. Mm, it has taken a revolution in the 21st century, and uh, therefore, the importance of English cannot be undermined. Importance of English cannot be actually undermined, cannot be underestimated. In the 19th century, India was used as a site of raw materials and as a ready market for British goods. But at present, Indians are in demand in professional services sector in capitalist countries. Very important. In 19th century, India was used as a site for raw materials and as a ready market for British goods. But there has been a there has been a change in its scenario as compared to the 19th century scenario and the present scenario. At present, Indians are in demand in professional sector, in professional in services sector in capitalist countries, while Indian professionals have uh, I mean, carved a niche in the information technology sectors abroad. Uh, it is worth reckoning that it is only in the field of software that we are sought after and not in the designing of hardware. So, uh, as as industrialization has grown, information technology has expanded. The demand in professional services has also gone up. The demand in professional services has also gone up, and accordingly, the demand for competence, the demand for the language, the demand for the command over the language has also gained importance in the present context. In the present context, so uh, dear participants, as we take on the discussion further, as we take on the discussion further, uh, we should keep it in our mind that uh, learning English, the problems are teaching and learning English literature is obviously a burning topic and which need to be studied carefully, and which, because of its importance, because of its social context, we shall explore how English teaching is negotiated. In our discussion, we shall also explore how English teaching is negotiated, how English teaching is actually negotiated in our classrooms. So, what are the specific problems associated with the enterprise? Uh, what are the specific problems associated with this enterprise? So, in the meantime, I would also want to give hints on the probability of probable area on which you are supposed to get a question. You may get a question like critically evaluate the role and function of English teacher in India. Critically evaluate the role and function of English teacher in India. And with this actually context in mind, we should take our discussion further. So, as I told you, friends, we shall explore how English teaching is negotiated, how English teaching is negotiated in our classrooms, what are the specific problems associated with this enterprise, and in this block, let us critically examine, let us critically view the paradigms that envelop English teaching in our country. In this block, we should critically view, we should critically examine the paradigms that envelop English teaching in our country. Uh, our colonial past cannot be actually brushed aside. We have already discussed many times while discussing English as a language in previous classes that since we have a colonial past, our colonial past cannot be brushed aside, cannot be cannot be actually forgotten while teaching colonizers' language and literature. While while we are teaching English literature, when we are teaching English language. English language. When we are teaching English language, when we are teaching English literature, we should not forget the colonial past, because our colonial past cannot be put aside, cannot be brushed aside, cannot be ignored. And therefore, the legacy of the past, the legacy of the past, I mean the colonial past, the legacy of the past, I want to mean the colonial past, as one of the uh, one of the academics, Minakhi Mukherjee, one of the prominent actually critics, Minakhi Mukherjee, points out, she points out the legacy of the past uh, inevitably creeps in, inevitably creeps in, automatically comes in. Legacy, I mean the colonial past automatically comes in the context of in social context, when we are discussing on language teaching, when we are discussing on English teaching, English learning, uh, in India, the legacy of the past automatically comes in, automatically appears, automatically creeps in. And in our post-colonial classrooms, it automatically our we post-colonial classroom, in our post-colonial classrooms. So we are teaching a foreign language. We are teaching English as I mean a foreign language. Therefore, the colonial past automatically comes while we are teaching in our classrooms. So therefore, Minaki Mukherjee rightly says that legacy of the past creeps in our post-colonial classrooms. So the institutionalizing of English, so the popularization of English, English as a medium of I mean teaching in institutions, in establishments, in educational setup, uh, institutionalizing of English continues to shape the course of English studies even today. Thus, English studies in India inevitably is also a uh, reappraisal of English studies is therefore inevitably is a reprisal of what is taught in the classroom, how a text is taught in the classroom, who is taught, why this is being taught. Uh, these are the questions. What is taught in the classroom? How a text is taught in the classroom? Who is taught? And why is this being taught? So, this English studies in India inevitably is a reappraisal of these questions. And the answer to the above categories, what is taught, how a text is taught, who is taught, why is this being taught, what, how, who, and why. The answer to the above categories actually will enable us to appreciate the state of function of English studies in India. It will enable us this what, how, why, who, these questions, which are which are considered reappraisal in the mind of the learners, in the mind of the English language speaker, will enable us to appreciate the state of function of English studies, the state of function of English studies in India. So, dear participants, before we comment upon the function of English studies, before we comment on the function of English studies uh, in India, let us be very clear about the objectives of literary studies. Let us be very clear about the objectives, about the aims of literary studies. So, we have to uh, admit, uh, we have to admit We have to recognize, we have to believe that literary studies do not operate in a social vacuum. Uh, we have to admit the fact, we have to recognize the fact, we have to believe that literary studies do not operate in a social vacuum. We cannot think of literary studies, we cannot actually think of literary studies isolating this social context, isolating the social phenomenon. Therefore, we have to believe that literary studies do not operate in a social vacuum. Teaching of literature is uh, not a mere unraveling of aesthetic markers. Teaching of English not only a mere unraveling, a mere discussion, a mere presentation of issues uh, uh, in relation to aesthetics or in the context of aesthetics, I mean values. So therefore, teaching English, teaching of literature is not a mere unraveling, is not a mere presentation of facts in the context of its aesthetics, aesthetic values. So literature is as much a product of a society. Very important. These three things are very important. As I told you, we have to admit the fact, we have to recognize the fact, we have to believe that literary studies do not operate in a social vacuum. It the studies of literature cannot be isolated from the social context. Teaching of literature uh, is not a mere unraveling of aesthetic markers. Teaching of literature is not mere a presentation in the context of its aesthetic values only. Literature is as much a product of a society. It emerges, it emerges from as any of society's other material productions. It emerges from as any of society's other material productions. There are a number of issues, particularly in relation to the social, site, and therefore literary productions, literary studies. Uh, uh, it emerges from as any of society's other material productions. Literary productions cannot be diversed from its social its social moorings, moorings, social moorings, social setup. Literary production, literary works, literary, writings, literary, literary productions cannot be diverse from its social setup, its social moorings. So, given these premises, English literary studies cannot be examined without the social uh, or political context. So, when we are uh, concentrating our discussion and when we are of the opinion that literary studies do not operate in a social vacuum, the we cannot isolate social dimensions, social issues while we are reading or while we are studying literary studies, and therefore it is not only presentation of facts. Literature is not only unraveling of facts, particularly in the context of aesthetic values, and it is as much a product of society as we discussed certain actually points here. So, given these premises, uh, under these circumstances, English literary studies cannot be examined without the social or political context, without the social or political context. So, how we should teach English literature in India? How we should teach English literature in India? These questions, according to Meenakshi Mukherjee, one of the, uh, mm, I mean, one of the academics, a, the question, according to Meenakshi Mukherjee, is linked with our perception regarding the nature of literature itself. So it depends on our perception, it depends on our insight. And if we look at literature as embodying transcendental truths, as a repository of universal, eternal truth and values, then we could teach literature purely from aesthetic points of view. Please understand it. If we so, how should we teach English literature in India? This question is linked with our perception. This question is linked with our actually thinking, with our insight regarding the nature of literature itself. So, if we look at literature, if we consider, literary studies as embodying transcendental truth, as a repository of universal, eternal truth and values, then we could teach literature purely from aesthetic point of view. Very right. Uh, from the point of view of its aesthetic merits, uh, from the view of from aesthetic point of view, from the view of its aesthetic merits. On the other hand, if you view literature, if you view literary studies as a representative product of its age, so he actually, Meenakshi Mukherjee, as an academic, actually wants to underline two things. So, depending upon the perception of the learner, depending upon the perception of the language learner, English studies learner, English literature learner, uh, whether it will be concluded whether it is in relation with the aesthetic merits or it is in relation with the cultural merit. So, if we look at literature as embodying transcendental truth, if we look at literature as a repository of universal truth, if we look at literature as an eternal truth and values, then we could teach literature purely from aesthetic point of view, from the point of view of its aesthetics merits. But on the other hand, if we view literature as a representative product of its age, as a representative product of its culture, then we shall recognize its setup, we can recognize its moorings in history and a specific cultural context. So it depends on the perception of the perception of language. English learning, literature learning, and we would then view literature within the context of social, political, linguistic, and institutional structures. We would then view, so depending upon our perception, whether it can be linked with aesthetic values, whether it can be linked with cultural values, whether it can be linked with political values, and we should have the choice of framing our syllabus. So we should have also the choice of framing our syllabus, restructuring its actually uh, uh, script, uh, which will suit to our changing needs and concerns. We should have also choice of framing our syllabus. We should have also choice of restructuring our syllabus uh, so as to suit our changing needs, so as to suit our changing needs and concerns. So, uh, therefore, uh, restructuring of syllabus is also very important. And Keeping this fact in mind, keeping this fact in mind, that how it will suit uh, to the changing needs, the syllabus should also be framed. The syllabus should also be structured. Once we agree upon the purpose of uh, literary teaching, once we agree upon the purpose of literary teaching as a socially useful activity, once we agree upon the purpose of literature teaching as a socially useful activity, then we can embark upon drawing up innovative, alternative, multiple optional courses to energize English literature studies and bring them closer to our cultural metrics. So, while we are actually giving importance to the uh, framework of syllabus, when we are thinking about restructuring of syllabus, uh, uh, preferably which will suit to the changing needs of the time, we uh, should agree upon the purpose of literature teaching as a socially useful activity. We should agree upon the purpose of literature teaching as a socially useful activity. So, we can also embark upon drawing up innovative, alternative, multiple optional courses to energize English literature studies and bring them closer to our cultural metrics. So, curriculum revision, I mean, to revise the courses, to revise the curriculum, to revise the syllabus also entails a recognition of important facts. While we are going to change the syllabus, when we are going to change the curriculum, when we are going to revise the course curriculum, uh, it entails a recognition of important facts such as availability of availability of text, availability of text, availability of text, marketing, uh, uh, actually marketing for fund publishing constraints, flow of funds, grants, library infrastructure, etc., etc. Curriculum revision also entails a recognition of important facts. So while we are restructuring syllabus, when we are going to prepare curriculum, a number of things are taken into consideration. What are they? So how sufficient number of text should be made available, how marketing will be successful, and how funds publishing constraints can be removed, mm, uh, and how the flow of funds can be ascertained, grants, library infrastructure, and these are some of the questions that should come to the mind of the actually framer. I mean, come to the persons who are entrusted with the work of curriculum revision, syllabus designing. So, this again proves that literate, literature studies do not operate a pure aesthetic realm. It is governed by material forces. So, if we purely concentrate that the literature should be particularly in the context of aesthetics values, uh, it can it may not serve the purpose. So, because certain factors are there, and these factors govern the material forces. So, Minakhi Mukherjee, as a prominent academics in English literature studies, also gives her opinion uh, by analyzing how contemporary critical theories can validate alternative strategies of teaching and learning English literature in our country. As one of the prominent academics, as one of the prominent, essayist, as one of the prominent, thinker, uh, uh, doing works on English literature studies. Meenakshi uh, says that by analyzing how contemporary critical theories can validate alternative strategies of teaching and learning English literature in our country. So, one, according to her, one fixed monolithic interpretation of a text has been rejected now. Fixed, monotonous, monolithic representation of a text has been outdated, has been rejected now. So it has been made possible to break the shackle, to break the barrier of centralized pedagogue centered learning. So, uh, as we discussed, that curriculum should be designed, syllabus should be framed, taking into consideration it's actually taking into consideration or taking the facts into mind how it will suit to the changing needs of the time. Uh, Accordingly, Meenakshi also gives her actually valued opinion that it has been made possible to break the shackle, break the barrier of centralized pedagogue centered learning. So, in our classrooms now, an active two-way negotiation of text is being encouraged in our classrooms. Now, an active two-way negotiation of text is being encouraged now. Encouraged now, and the teaching is no longer uh, the sole disseminator of knowledge. A teacher is no longer the sole disseminator of knowledge. So the text is open to interpretation now. The text is open to interpretation now. The text is based more on discussion now. The text is based more on dialogue now. The text is more based on debate now. So, therefore, she says that in our classrooms now an active two-way negotiations of text is being encouraged, and teacher is no longer the sole disseminator of knowledge. So one way actually my business in the classroom has become outdated. The text is open for discussion. The text is based on more on discussion. It is actually based on dialogue, debate. It has encouraged thereby what is its merit? It has encouraged collaborative learning. Collaborative learning. It has encouraged collaborative learning in our classroom. It has encouraged collaborative learning in our classroom, and uh, it has also engaged the learner's skill, and to prioritize such tasks, to give importance to such tasks, to prioritize such tasks in our teaching of English literature would be a meaningful and rewarding engagement. So, when we are giving importance, when we are giving priority to such tasks in our teaching of English literature, it would be it should be a meaningful and rewarding engagement, mm, both for the teacher, also for the learner. So, when students are empowered to read literary text, when students are empowered to read literary text based on their acquired knowledge of reading, based on their acquired knowledge of teaching, based on their acquired knowledge of I mean, reading skills. When students are empowered to read literary text based on their acquired knowledge of reading skill, they would be able to negotiate with the literary text very comfortably. They will be able to negotiate with the with the text, with the books at each comfortably, and their competence will also be enhanced. Their competence will also be enhanced. So, at this point of our discussion, it is very pertinent to point out that teaching and learning strategies with regard to English studies have to take into account the various historical, cultural, market driven forces and that have shaped English studies in India. So, as we discussed in this at this point of our discussion, it is very pertinent to point out that teaching and learning strategies with regard to English studies, with regard to English literature, with regard to learning of English, uh, have to take into account the various historical, cultural, aesthetic, market driven forces that have shaped English studies in India now. And obviously, uh, this obviously uh, this calls for innovative and sensitive strategies. So, without this actually principle in mind, that if the uh, syllabus designer does not become innovative, if the syllabus designer does not take into account the curriculum need, changing needs of time, it will not serve the purpose, and teaching and learning will not actually achieve any goal. So, therefore, this calls for innovative and sensitive strategies so that uh, undue emphasis is not placed on the uh, printed word, but that the historical context of the work, the cultural placing of the work in our culture specific environment uh, is recognized and established with uh, actually with a meaningful purpose. It is established with a meaningful purpose. It is established with a meaningful, I mean, goal. And at the same time, let us uh, remind ourselves that literature is not to be studied as a distinctive, privileged discourse, to be evolved in exclusion of other discourses. So, in fact, literature is one of the many discourses and one among the many modes of representation that circulate in a society at a particular historical time and space. So we cannot. So therefore, rightly, some of the academics, some of the writers rightly say that at the same time we have to keep it in mind. We have to keep it in mind that literature is not to be studied as a distinctive privileged discourse, to be evolved in exclusion of other discourses. We cannot isolate it from other discourses. In fact, literature is one of the many discourses, and one amongst the many modes of representation that circulate in a society at a particular historical time and space. So, uh, uh, another academics known as Shabir Kaul points out, rightly points out that literature is one of our ways of ordering experience. Ah, literature, he says, Shabir Kaul, Subir Shabir, Kaul Kaul, another, I mean, academics points out that literature is one of our ways of ordering experience. It is not the only way of doing so. Hmm. This perception would lead us to another significant recognition, and that no one particular literature ought to be privileged over literatures in other languages. So, in the Indian context, participants, friends, in the Indian context, the bilingual or often multilingual potentialities of our students and teachers need to be put into use, need to be put into use. Very important. According to Shabir Kaul, uh, in the Indian context, when we are discussing the problems of teaching learning literature in India, he rightly says that in the Indian context, the bilingual or often multilingual potentialities of our students, of our teachers need to be put into use in our English literature classrooms. So, we have to unlearn the monolingual metropolitan manner of teaching text, which the West has handed down to us. And of a hindrance, instead of a hindrance, our bilingual actually could act as a positive force. Our bilingualism uh, uh, could act as a positive force uh, for a teacher, energizing and sharpening our critical insights, sharpening our perception, sharpening our insight, sharpening our learning skills. And therefore, he rightly says that instead of a hindrance, our bilingualism could actually could act as a positive force, energizing our insight, energizing our perception, energizing our language learning skills, our critical insights. So, therefore, uh, uh, why the many when this actually topic mm, uh, is one of the important topics among the other actually as compared to other blogs. Here, so many critics they advocate a study of literary and non-literary text from Indian languages along with English text on India and English literary classics to negotiate what's they call the burden of teaching English in India, and therefore, well, the without erasing the difference that marks the text, uh, many academics they argue one could foreground the collaborative para, I mean, psychical contrary restraints paradigms that regulate them, and the complicity between British and colonial in the case of Indian literature needs to be brought forth in our classrooms. This does not necessarily involve a conflating of the two literatures or even collapsing of boundaries, national culture. So, they cite one example in case of Tagore's work, Tagore's Didi. The protagonist Sasi's affection for her orphaned younger brother prompts her to protect him from the avarice of her husband, while Sasi's defense of her husband could be seen as a revolt against patriarchy. Her decision to hand over the custody of her minor brother to British magistrate and her return to her husband's hearth. So they cite this example that actually why does she choose to re-enter this suffocating space? What does her colony? What does her choice of transference of control of her brother's welfare and his legacy? the future colonial subject and his future to the British official indicate. So this text, as the critic says, argues, could be studied to analyze the development of colonial subjectivity. How did the colonial subject view herself in relation to the imperial rulers? How much of her personality was molded, so uh, conditioned by the expectations of the imperial master? So, in fact, problems of teaching English literature in India is not actually on, I mean, intersected with the subjects of fascinating or colonial subject. This is further amplified in uh, amplified, and therefore uh, uh, here I mean the mm, uh, they are of the opinion that the national, I mean the Indian students, when they are studying the text, uh, the post colonial actually the colonial actually dimension, colonial actually pictures cannot be isolated, cannot be brushed aside. We have already discussed, it cannot be put aside, it cannot be brushed aside, it cannot be taken away. While we are analyzing a text, we are studying a text in post colonial dimensions, in post colonial period, in post colonial dimension, in post colonial period. So uh, English studies, uh, therefore, is here to stay. We cannot actually give a break, but it cannot be studied in historical vacuum. Its entry as well as continued presence in Indian universities need to be foregrounded, need to be foregrounded, and a vigorous historization of language teaching is a political and academic necessity. Therein lies the possibility of a more rewarding negotiation in the classrooms, both for the teacher as well as for the student. Therefore, it lies the possibility of a more rewarding negotiation in the classroom, both for the teacher as well as for the students. While the continued use of English and its privileged position in our post-colonial culture needs to be problematized, it does not follow that we argue for dispensing with English altogether. We cannot actually go for dispensing with English. We cannot actually think, we cannot actually put forth our opinion, put forth our argument that we can manage without this language, we can manage without English. We cannot. And the setting up of a polarity between English and Hindi in terms of the native and the foreign, revivalism, westernization is inevitably ridden with dangers and anxieties, in particular for linguistics and religious minorities. And therefore, uh, we on our front can carry on productive and self reflective engagement with English literature. We on our front, therefore, should carry on a productive, self reflective engagement with English literature by resorting to radical pedagogic strategies, by changing up syllabus, by changing the curriculum, by questioning, expanding the canon, by opting for interdisciplinary, non literary studies, and by exploiting our bilingualism proactivity, bilingualism proactively in our classrooms. To search for the choice of alternative, however, should not foreclose the debate over the problems of teaching and learning English literature in India. We cannot. We on our forefront, we on our front can carry on a productive, self-reflective engagement with English literature by resorting to, by adopting a radical pedagogic strategy. We should adopt radical pedagogic strategies. We should adopt radical strategies. We should adopt course curriculum. which will suit to the changing needs, which will suit to the present generation by questioning, expanding the canon, uh, by opting for interdisciplinary non-literary studies, and by exploiting our bilingualism proactively in our classroom. We should also exploit our bilingualism proactively in our classrooms. And the search for and the choice of alternatives, however, should not foreclose the debate over the problems. So, therefore, when there is a problem, there is also a remedy. And the remedy, as the experts suggest, that we should go for, I mean, exploiting our bilingualism proactively in our classroom, and the search for and choice of alternatives, however, should not foreclose the debate and over the problems of teaching and learning of English literature in India. It will, we cannot stop, and therefore English studies is here to stay. It cannot be stopped. It cannot be actually, we cannot say, we cannot dispense with English. We cannot manage without this language. Okay, thanking you all. With this, we end the discussion today.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, friends. I want to give an information. Uh, there are two blocks questioning canons and just a minute. So I think these are all small actually topics. These two are small topics.
Thank you, sir.
Hello. Block 6 and block 7. Uh, Hello. Are you able to listen me?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Block 6 questioning the canon and block 7 evolution of canons. So these are I mean small actually topics. So we can take up both the topics block 6 and 7 in a single class. We can take up these two blocks in a single class. So on 27th you have MEG-10 block 6, and on 29th you have MEG-10 block 7, evolution of canons in Indian English writing and questioning the canon. So because these two are very small topics, so we can finish it in one class. Okay, and I think we will take up day after tomorrow. On 27th we can take up uh, these two blocks, block 6 and 7.
Yes, sir.
Could you follow me?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Uh,
sir.
okay, okay. Thank you all for
Thank you, sir.
active
Thank you, sir.
participation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Hello? Yes? What did you say?
Thank you,
Did you
sir.
say something? Are you going to speak something? Hello?
No, sir.
No,
Thank you, sir.
And what about tomorrow? Tomorrow is on MEG 11. Uh, Tomorrow, so there is, actually the we have also class tomorrow. We have on 26th. We have also a class on MEG 11.
MEG 11.
Uh, all right. As per the schedule, we will have to engage the class because we have been allotted class and we cannot stop it. We cannot stop it. Whether uh, it hardly matters how many participants will participate, but I will have to come in time for the class because it is on the schedule. For I am talking of the class of tomorrow. And a day after tomorrow, we will have discussion on block 6 and 7. That is very small portions, and that is not also very significant. That is not that much important. You are not, because you are supposed to get a question mm, on today's discussion, that it is very important. You may get, it is very probable on today's discussion you may get a question. The so, and questioning canon and the other part block 7, it is that it is not that much important, and I don't think questions will come on that area. Okay, thank you. Nah, juga kayak kelas.